Great to be here. When I was growing up, we had a running thing in our family, which was probably most of you have this. There was one group of people in our family that were always known to be late. And every time we had an event, we thought maybe we should send them a special invitation that had a different time on it so that we told them the event was at 7, maybe they would actually show up at 8 when the event actually started. The ironic part is that now my family became that one in our family, and we're the ones who are notoriously late. But I thought about this. I want to just give you some background about the Talmud. Today's lecture is about the Talmud and about something from this week's Daf Yomi. The Talmud is the central text of the Jewish people. It's been for many generations. And yes, the Torah about the Talmud is really the book that has both the basis for all of Jewish law, which we call halacha, and also it has Jewish theology in it. Today's lecture is focusing on the aspect of Jewish law. And halacha, Jewish law, is basically a legal system. And like any legal system, it has to contend with many different issues that legal systems have to contend with. If we compare it to American legal system or British legal system, we'll find some comparisons. However, there's something very different about the Jewish legal system, and that's that there's two different tracks, I would say, in the Jewish legal system. We have one track, which is what we call Ben Adam Lamakom, which is between man or woman and God. And that's a track that doesn't generally exist in other legal systems that we can, if we compare to at least certain legal systems like American law, British law, other countries. They generally have the Ben Adam Lechavero, which is more interhuman connection, relationships, monetary issues, capital law. And what I want to show today is how the Talmud addresses how the halachic system, and we'll track it both on the track of Ben Adam Lechavero and on the track of Ben Adam Lamakom, both between man and God and also between us and our fellow man. So today, what I want to focus on specifically is a topic, as you see in the lecture, as of human error, and how the Jewish legal system takes human error into consideration. Okay, how much a person would err, how, and we're going to see in a few different directions where the legal system has to contend with this. So the topic for today in the Daf Yomi, we've been learning Pesachim for the last 2 weeks. Pesachim is about Pesach, is about Passover holiday. And the first issue that the Masechet deals with is chametz on Pesach, and basically getting rid of chametz. It starts with b'dichat chametz, checking your house for chametz, which we do the day before Pesach, the night before. And according to Torah law, and I'm not going to get into the details where we get this from, those learning the daf know that we already learned this, but the Torah law says not only is it forbidden, or at least the rabbis derive that it's a Torah prohibition, not only is chametz forbidden for the 7 days of Passover, it's also forbidden from 6 hours into the day. When I talk about hours, this goes back to an old Roman system, which they divided the day into 12 equal hours from sunrise to sunset. So whenever we use the terminology today of hours, we really mean what we call sha'ot zmaniot in halacha, which is a percentage of the entire day, basically not necessarily a 60-minute hour. But we'll, for all intents and purposes, we'll say midday, which is chatzot, 12 o'clock, noon. So now the rabbis, what happened is the rabbis said, wait a minute, if the Torah law prohibits chametz from 6 hours into the day, well, what if people make mistakes? What if they err? And then we have to contend with that, and we have to come up with a solution. We don't want people to err. So the first thing is, why were they so concerned about chametz and people eating chametz? Don't we all know we don't eat chametz? It's pretty clear. It shouldn't be so complicated. So the first thing to know is that there's a number of complications with chametz, or reasons to be very stringent. The first is, the Torah says, if you eat chametz on Pesach, you get karet. What is karet? It means you get cut off. It's a severe punishment by God. Nobody knows exactly what it means because it's a punishment by God. The court won't, punish you for doing it, but God will punish you directly. So that's number one. Karet always scares people. So that was the first reason the rabbis got a little bit concerned. The second thing is that normally in regular laws of forbidden foods, we have concepts that items are nullified into others. For example, you have a cholent pot and your milk falls into the cholent pot. If it's a little bit of milk and there's 60 times the amount of meat in compared to the milk. So the milk becomes nullified and you're fine. You don't have to throw out your whole chillin. But if a little bit of chametz is mixed in, it's a problem. And therefore, people are very concerned about it. The last point is a very interesting one, which is that people are used to eating chametz all year round. And if people eat chametz all year round, there's a concern that maybe they'll forget that chametz is forbidden and they'll eat. So for example, I don't know if it ever happened to you, but on Yom Kippur, for example, you might actually be nervous that maybe you'll accidentally eat, especially people who have little kids at home. Sometimes you're preparing the food for them and they're eating on Yom Kippur. You might accidentally taste something. There's always this fear, maybe Yom Kippur less so, but maybe another fast more so. There's a concern that maybe accidentally you're so used to eating that you might accidentally eat. So for all these reasons, the rabbis were very concerned. And because of that, and now the real issue that becomes interesting is if chametz eating is between me and God, why is it important for the rabbis to prevent me from making a mistake? I understand if it affects other people around me, but if it's just between me and God, why are the rabbis getting involved? And this is where the rabbis saw themselves as safeguarding the Torah. And if there's a concern that people might end up accidentally doing something wrong, the rabbis want to put up boundaries and say, we have to safeguard the Torah, we have to make sure, and this is a very serious issue, chametz on Pesach. And you could also think about, by the way, that I understand on Pesach I'm not going to eat, but this is Erev Pesach. People might not have taken Erev Pesach so seriously. They might have said, hey, it's not really the holiday yet. The holiday only starts at night. So that's another possible reason as to why. The question now becomes, how much can we assume people make mistakes? The other issue to know is that in their day, they didn't have telephones, they didn't have watches, all sorts of ways that we nowadays tell time. And we know the exact time, right? You can always look at your phone and your phone is linked up to every system and everyone has now the exact correct time. But in those days, they didn't have all the correct times. They didn't know. They went by sundials, they went by estimations. And it's another reason why the rabbis were very concerned, particularly when it came to telling time, that people might err and they might make mistakes. So the question is, first of all, how much can we assume people will mess up the time? That's the first question. The second question is, if that's the case, so how much earlier? If the rabbis want to say, let's make chametz forbidden earlier, so then the question is, how much earlier? That's number one. Number two, can we distinguish between, if we want to take this not just for chametz, but across the board, can we distinguish between different, or even within chametz, are there different types of people? For those learning Gemara know that the Gemara talks about a chaver and an am haaretz. There were people in society, it was split up into people, or kohanim, priests were known to be more careful about things. Is there a way to say, we have a system, we want to, on the one hand, you want to keep a system objective and clear, and the rules are all the same for everybody. On the other hand, sometimes you might need to make dispensations or say, well, we're more concerned about you than other people. I'll give you an example. Maybe in your house, you have a curfew for some of your children and not other children. Right? Maybe there's children of yours that are hanging out very late doing things you're not so happy about. So you might put in an earlier curfew for them, where you might have other kids who are, the angel type, and you're not really worried about anything they're involved in. And if it's on a one-off, they want to go out really late. So you might say it's okay. Is it okay to do that in a system of law? Can you make distinctions between different types of people or different types of situations where there's more of a concern, less of a concern? So that's another question. How much, and this comes up all the time in the Talmud, which is how much is the system a subjective system and how much is it objective? Right? Do we have to have clear, and there's a concept, for example, called lo plug. We don't distinguish. If this is the way the law is, we're going to put it across the board, even if it's not necessarily relevant. And that's one type of approach. But many times we see the other approach, which is that the Gemara starts to say, well, these people were worried about, these people were not worried about. So we're going to get back to that issue in today's topic. And if we're worried when it comes to chametz that people might mess up the time, and then we're going to be more stringent, so the question becomes, what about in other cases? Does this apply? We understand ben adam lemakom. When it comes between man and God, on the one hand, we say, what are the rabbis getting involved? On the other hand, you could say, well, there's reason for the rabbis to get involved to safeguard the Torah. So let's be stringent. But would the same apply in other situations where that's not our concern? Okay, we're going to see a case today about capital punishment and capital crimes. What if witnesses say different times? Are we going to say that their contradictory testimony, or maybe we say there's a certain margin of error that people will make, and is it the same margin of error that we have for chametz? So that's going to be the bulk of our questions for today. Okay, so now what's interesting about what the rabbis do, and we're going to see this, is that they use concepts and then they apply them to other cases. So I want to start today with our text. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Okay, well, also it should be in the chat, the source sheet, if you want to look, because I'm going to go back and forth by sharing it, not sharing it. So if you want to look back at it, you can link in through the chat. Okay, what I'm going to do is take some excerpts from from pages in 11b and 12a and 12b in the Gemara in Pesachim, and we're going to start learning them together, and then we'll go through, we'll analyze, and then we'll go back and connect it to why learning Talmud is important. Rabbi Meir Omer, Ochlim, we're going to start with a Mishnah. The way the Talmud works is it starts with a Mishnah. Usually the basis is from the Mishnah. A Mishnah is usually a very simple text, which then gets expanded upon and questioned by the Talmud, by the Gemara. So Rabbi Meir Omer, Ochlim kol chamesh v'sorfim b'tchilat shesh. He says basically that what we want to do is we want to forbid it, not just at the end of the 6th hour, but we're going to forbid it from the beginning of the 6th hour. Ochlim kol chamesh, you can eat chametz all of the 5th hour, and then we burn at the beginning of the 6th, and already you cannot eat anymore. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ochlim kol arba v'tolim kol chamesh v'sorfim b'tchilat shesh. You eat the first 4 hours of the day. This is what we actually do. You leave, we kind of are in a hanging state, the 5th hour. You can't eat it all, but you don't yet burn it. And sorfim b'tchilat shesh. And you burn it at the beginning of the 6th hour. Ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda. And then Rabbi Yehuda describes that not only did we make the hour earlier to make sure that nobody makes a mistake, but even more, you can see how concerned they were. He says, Ve'od amar Rabbi Yehuda, shtei chalot shel todah psulot munachot al gav ha'itzdeba. In the temple, they had 2 loaves. They would put a bread that were disqualified breads from a thanks offering, and they would put this on a high place. In the Gemara later, they say it's Gag. It's really the roof of the Itzba. Kol zman shemunachot kol ha'am ochlim. People would see them there. They'd know we can still eat. Nitzla achat. Once one was taken away, you have to remember, everybody went on Aliyah Regel. They all came to the temple. So everybody was there and everyone will be able to see. Nitzla achat tolin lo ochlim velo sorfim. As soon as one gets taken away, we wait. Everybody knows one taken away is your sign. You cannot eat anymore, but you don't yet burn. Nitzlu shtehen itchilu kol ha'am sorfim. As soon as both were removed, everybody knows that now it's time to burn. Okay, so what have we seen so far? We've seen a very simple machloket. Are we worried? And if you want to put this in the terms of error, which I kind of already set it up, according to Rabbi Meir, we go 1 hour earlier to make sure you don't make a mistake. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we go 2 hours earlier because we're worried about an error. The first thing the Gemara does is bring a Mishnah in Sanhedrin, which is a Masechet that deals with all sorts of capital crimes and witnesses, and how we accept testimony of witnesses and how we question them. And here the Gemara says, Tanan Hatam. It says in the Mishnah, I specifically cut out a bunch of things because I wanted to get through the material a little bit quicker, so I skipped parts. But I'm getting here to the core machloket debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, who are the exact 2 people that appear in our Mishnah. And what we're later going to see is that this section, this Mishnah in Sanhedrin, seems to contradict our Mishnah about chametz. So Echad Omer b'shtei sha'ot. If the first person witness comes and says the murder happened at 2 hours into the day, Ve'echad Omer b'shalosh sha'ot, and one said 3 hours into the day. So let's just call it, right? Let's say the sunrise is at 6. One said 8 in the morning. One said 9 in the morning. Edutan kayemet. We accept their testimony, right? That would never happen nowadays. If someone had the wrong time, we'd assume they were incorrect. They were lying. Echad Omer b'shalosh ve'echad Omer b'chamesh. Edutam b'telah. However, Rabbi Meir says that if one says 3 hours and the other one says 5 hours, that already is a margin of error that we don't think people err 2 hours. That's the way the simple reading sounds. Rabbi Yehuda says, Edutan kayemet. He says even 3 and 5 people confuse. But echad Omer b'chamesh ve'echad Omer b'sheva. If one says 5 and one says 7, then edutam betela. Again, 5 hours would be 11 o'clock, and 7 hours would be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then already, what's the issue? The sun is in the east in the morning hours, and it's in the west in the afternoon hours. So that is something that everybody knows to distinguish between, and therefore there's no concern. What we're going to have now is we're going to start reading. We're going to have 3 different interpretations as to what exactly the debate is between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about the witnesses. Okay, it's going to take a little while till we get back to the chametz on Pesach. So now we're going to talk first only about this capital crime that somebody did. 2 witnesses came. They had a differential in terms of what hour they said. According to Rabbi Meir, 1 hour difference is okay. We'll still accept them as witnesses. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even a 2-hour difference, as long as it doesn't cross the line between morning and afternoon, okay, and presumably also nighttime and morning, right, and after evening and night, let's say. Anytime where it's like that, it won't be an issue. So let's continue in the Gemara. We're now going to explain 3 different ways. 2 are different versions of what Abaye says. Because a lot of this wasn't written down originally, it was passed down. There's usually often mistakes or confusion by students about what exactly their rabbi said. So there's 2 versions of Abaye. The first version says, Kishetimtza lomar, if you really look into this, what would you figure out? L'divrei Rabbi Meir ein adam to'eh v'lo klum. Really, Rabbi Meir thinks, and then we could basically say he doesn't really relate to what we're talking about today, about a margin of error. He thinks that people don't make mistakes. He thinks that really, okay, now we're going to explain. How could he possibly say people don't make mistakes if he said 2 and 3 we can accept? Not because he views it as a mistake, but because he thinks that when you said 2 hours, I kind of said it differently. I said 2 hours means 8 o'clock, 2 hours into the day, and 3 hours means 9 o'clock. He's going to say that really 2 and 3 could mean one and the same, because there's different ways you could say it. You could say 2 hours, and you could really mean the end of the second hour. And you can say 3 hours and mean the beginning of the third hour. Now, the difference between the end of the second hour and the beginning of the third hour are really one and the same, because it's about the same exact time that it's happening. So he basically says 2 and 3 is okay, because 2 really meant, and here it's an issue of language. And this is another issue, which is a whole bigger issue, which we're not going to discuss today, which is how do we use language in determining what people meant? How do we assume that if somebody says something, what did they mean when they said this? Did they really mean to the beginning of the second hour or to the end of the second hour? So it's confusing. So he says that's why 2 and 3, but 3 and 5, no way. And then we go back to Abaye. What does Abaye say? Abaye says, Rabbi Yehuda, L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Adam to'eh chatzi sha'ah. A person could get confused by half an hour. How half an hour? So the Gemara explains that the event must have happened, at 4.5 hours into the day. The person who said 3, remember, he says 3 and 5, right? So the person who said 3 really meant end of the third, which really means beginning of fourth. And a person might confuse half an hour. So he thought it happened really 4.5 hours into the day. He thought it happened at 4 hours. So when he said 3, he really meant end of the fourth. The person who said 5 meant the beginning of the fifth. And then you end up with this half-hour difference each made, right, that you could say they were off by half an hour. Okay, so that's one way of reading it. Now we're going to bring a different explanation of Rabbi Yehuda. Ika da Amre, some people say, Am Rabbaye keshetimtza lomar, l'divrei Rabbi Meir adam to'eh mashu, l'divrei Rabbi Yehuda adam to'eh sha'a v'mashu. Okay, now we're going to have the difference. Is it a little bit or an hour and a little bit? How so? So again, we start with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is a little bit. That makes sense. We talked about that before. 2 and 3, 2 meant end of the second, 3 meant beginning of the third. The difference between beginning of the second, end of the second, beginning of the third is just a little bit. So he does think we factor in margin of error. He just thinks the margin of error is very minimal. Rabbi Yehuda says it's an hour and a bit. Okay, I won't go into all the details, but again, 3 and 5, 3 means end, 5 means beginning. There's an hour difference between them because it's 4 and end of beginning of fourth and end of fourth. Okay, so that's the two different explanations of Abai. I made a little chart to make it easy. So Abai version 1, a person doesn't err at all according to Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he errs by half an hour. According to Abai, a person errs a bit, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, a person errs by an hour and a bit. But the Gemara has a big question on Abai, and the Gemara asks, and this comes up just above here. Rav Huna Bered Rav Yehuda came, and he said the following in front of Rava, and he said, if we would check, Rava says, wait a minute, you're bringing me what Abai says, but wait a minute. What you're saying comes to a crazy conclusion. And this is an aspect I didn't really discuss before, but it's a very important element of this section, which is, if we were to say, Ilu daikinam bahane sade, let's say you want to suggest that maybe 3 meant end of 3 and 5 meant beginning of 5, and they're off by an hour. And the people only err about an hour. If people only err about an hour, what if the person who said 3 really meant beginning of 3? And the person who said 5 really meant end of 5. Now that means the difference between 3 and 6, that's 3 hours. And here comes the big clincher. He says, and then, Havya edut mukheshet. This is clearly, if one's saying 3 hours and one's saying 6 hours, they're clearly contradicting each other. Vilo katlinan. And then we shouldn't kill this person. And he didn't murder really, because there's contradictory testimony. Va'ana nekom v'niktom isfeka. And based on a doubt, we're going to kill the murderer because there's capital punishment according to the Torah. And he says, Rachmana Amar v'shaftu eda v'yitzilu eda. We have a responsibility as judges to find any kind of way to acquit someone. So here, and this is where it really becomes very different from the way we use this principle in Chametz B'Pesach. Chametz B'Pesach, we say, we're worried you might make a mistake. Because of that, what are we going to do? We're going to forbid chametz earlier. That's what we call astringency. Here, it's basically leading us to kill a murderer when we're not actually a convicted or an accused murderer, when it's possible that he actually didn't murder. And maybe these witnesses are really lying. And one means 3 and one means 6. So Rava says you can't say that we imagine there's a margin of error of 1 hour when possibly here we have a difference of 3 hours and we're still going to kill the person who we think is a murderer when it's possible they're lying. So instead of basically throwing this out the window, which you might have thought and said, maybe margin of error shouldn't factor in here because we're going to basically convict someone maybe even unnecessarily. But instead, Rava says, no, we still hold by this principle. And Rava basically says that the margin of error must be 3 hours according to Rabbi Yehuda. It must be a much bigger margin of error, and that's why we can kill the potential murderer or the accused murderer based on their testimony, because, again, he's going to make the distinction between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Meir says 2 and 3, which the widest gap could be beginning of 2, end of 3, which is 2 to 4, which is 2 hours. So Ela Amar Rava, the Divrei Rabbi Meir, Adam to'esh 2 sha'ot chaser mashu. And the Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Adam to'esh 3 sha'ot chaser mashu. So basically, he says it must be that we have a much wider margin of error, 2 hours or 3 hours. So now, let's look at our chart again. We have either no error at all, half an hour error, or a bit versus an hour and a bit, or 2 hours or 3 hours. Forget about the bit. I don't want to focus on that. It's not important right now. Comes the Gemara, and the Gemara says, wait a minute. None of these answers fit in with our Mishnah. Because our Mishnah said, remember, Rabbi Meir says 1 hour, and Rabbi Yehuda says 2 hours. Now look back at that chart. Does anyone think that Rabbi Meir says 1 hour? No, it's either not at all, a bit, or 2 hours. And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say 2 hours anywhere. He says half an hour and a bit, or 3 hours and a bit. So basically nothing seems to match the Mishnah. And the Gemara seems to think these must be one and the same. The same rules must apply. So how could this be? So I'm not going to go through all the details because it's kind of obvious. I don't want to spend our time reading everything inside. But again, according to this testimony, let's start with Abaye. We have a person either doesn't err at all or errs a bit. And yet on Pesach, it's a whole hour. And Rabbi Yehuda says either half an hour or an hour and a bit, and we stop eating 2 hours before. So Abaye is going to give a very interesting answer, and this goes back to my example about the curfew. Abaye says, Ela Amar Abaye, Edut Misura Lizrizin, Chametz Lakol Masur. This is a fascinating line. He says, okay, let's read it in English. He says, testimony is entrusted to the vigilant. Okay, and if you look at the translation, this comes from Sefaria, which is from the Steinsaltz translation, the Koren. One comes to testify only if he's thoroughly scrutinized the subject of his testimony, and therefore he will not err significantly with regard to the time in question. However, when it comes to chametz on Pesach, that is something, it's across the board. Everybody's commanded. And here we get to the difference between what they call in the words of the Gemara often the amcha, the people, the general people. We're much more worried that they're going to do things wrong. Whereas whoever comes to testify as a witness must be a more serious person. Now, why would you think that? If you saw a murder, wouldn't you come forward? But the fact is that if you see a murder and you want to come to court, what happens is they grill you in court and they put you through the ringer. And it's not so pleasant. And unless you really care and you're a serious person, you might not actually come to court. So therefore they say, we're assuming, now then you have to make another jump. If someone's vigilant, we're assuming they're not going to get confused about time. The time is something they're more careful about. And especially if a murder happened and they're watching it, they're going to be very careful and they know they want to come to court. They're going to be very careful to check the time. Whereas if you take the average person on the street, maybe serious people will be careful about chametz on Pesach, but since we can't start distinguishing between who has to stop eating chametz at whatever time, therefore we make one rule that's going to apply across the board and be concerned for all those people that might not do things right. And therefore we make a distinction. So that's the first distinction between, and which really what's interesting about it is it's not really a distinction. Both have this assumption that there's a margin of error and maybe even the same margin of error. It just might be different for different populations. And the Eidut is a different population. So if, for example, the Eidut wasn't a different population, it would be the same both for stringencies in the law and for things that go on in the court. You follow that distinction? That it's really just, it's a technical reason, really. But theoretically, the same principles should apply. We move now to the next question, which is what about Rava? So according to Rava, it ends up the opposite, which is Rabbi Meir is going to end error by 2 hours in testimony, right? He thinks a person could err by 2 hours or less a bit. Rabbi Yehuda says 3 hours. And when it comes to Pesach, it's the reverse. We do less time for both opinions. It's only 1 hour earlier for Rabbi Meir and 2 hours for Rabbi Yehuda. So again, we have this problem. And again, the Gemara says, well, the issue is something external. What's the issue? Pay attention to the time. When is chametz b'Pesach forbidden? Midday. Remember we talked in the Mishnah about midday? What's the difference about midday? In the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, it said, if it were between 5 and 7, we know to distinguish. Therefore, they say there's less of a concern when it's right near the middle of the day that people will err so badly. If it's supposed to be noon, you won't get confused and think 10 o'clock, right? You won't think 10 o'clock is noon. You might think, and that's what Rabbi Meir says, you might think 5 hours into the day is the same as 6 hours. That you might confuse. But you're not going to confuse 4 hours into the day and 6 hours into the day because the sun is right at the center of the sky. And clearly at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's not really. So therefore, that's one approach to an answer. But then the Gemara says if people don't make mistakes, and now again, we get into minute details. This is classic for the Gemara. Well, if we don't get into mistakes and we know it's the sun is right in the center of the sky, then why did Rabbi Meir say at all 5 hours? He should have said until the 6th hour. So they say, right? No, because already the difference between 5 and 6, already the sun is already closer to the center of the sky. People could confuse that. What about Rabbi Yehuda? Why does he start at 4 hours when he really thinks people can err 3 hours? So they answer the same answer, but again, 4 hours, right? 4 hours, you might confuse, but right, well, they're going to say that once you get closer to the center of the right, and basically, let me just say it in very clear terms. What we're saying is that the difference between Sanhedrin and chametz on Pesach, Pesachim, is the courts versus the chametz is really no difference. It's just that the examples given for chametz, it was around midday. And for the other case, it wasn't, for the courts, it wasn't around midday. And that's why. So first, Abaye tries to answer why the whole question with Rabbi Yehuda becomes, if you're not going to confuse the time, then why? So that's why you're not going to say 3 hours into the day, but still 4 hours into the day, you shouldn't confuse. So again, Abaye answers the difference. Abaye basically gives an answer for Rava and said, Edut Mesural is Lizim, Chametz Lakom Asur. We're going to make a distinction. However, Rava doesn't like his answer, and Rava says, no. The reason for Rabbi Yehuda is an outside technical reason. Okay, and here I charted it out also. Rava says that when it comes to, he says, Lav Hainu Tamid Rabbi Yehuda, it's not because of margin of error in chametz. That's not the issue. The issue is that Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein bior chametz ela sreifa, you need to burn it. Since you need to burn at the beginning of the 6th hour, what do we do? Well, you need an hour. You're busy in the morning eating all the rest of your chametz. You need an hour to collect your twigs and make your fire. That's why we need to do it 4 hours. But really, at 5 hours, one might confuse 1 hour, but not 3 hours, like he said by Sanhedrin in the court case. And therefore, it's a separate issue. He needs to gather wood. The Gemara actually doesn't like this answer. Again, I skipped this section, but they come up with a different answer. And Rava answers another answer, which is a very interesting answer, again, telling us about the life and the time of the Talmud. He says, Gzera mishum yom ha'meunan. What if it's a cloudy day? If it's a cloudy day, you won't be able to tell the time. And therefore, it's an issue. And comes this funny answer. They said, well, if it's a cloudy day, you won't know the difference between 4 hours, 3 hours, right? Why until 4 is it okay? You won't really know at all. So he says, well, 4 is the time everybody ate. And because it's the time everybody ate, so everybody knew, right? Your stomach kind of tells you what time, when it's 10 o'clock. And right, in Israel, they always call it Aruchat Esel. That's the 10 o'clock morning meal. Everybody ate at 10 o'clock in the morning. That's why at 4 hours into the day, everybody will know when it's 4 hours, because there's other ways, and this is what's interesting, there's other ways of telling time. It's not just about seeing the sun. So once you hit 4 hours and you eat, at that point, we're worried people might get confused. Okay, so what did we see here? The most interesting thing we saw, in my mind, is that the rabbis treated this principle of how much one would err and what the margin of error is across the board, not just to be stringent in a halacha between man and God, but also for this issue of the court. And even though here it will come that maybe we'll end up saying someone's guilty when maybe the witnesses were really contradicting each other, we say there's a margin of error, and that margin of error, that principle applies across the board. So it's very interesting to see that even though we might have thought that the realm of God-related laws and man-related laws would be different tracks and maybe different principles, what they're really saying is that it's one and the same. And I think that I want to suggest that this is why there's a very strange line at the end of this section. And I say it's strange because I teach Daf Yomi. I've been through at this point every page in the Talmud, and I don't recall seeing something like this. Maybe there is, but I don't really recall seeing a line that reads like this. Amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is the one who is known to have edited the Talmud. He basically put it together, and it's almost like he puts his stamp at the end of this section to say what I was suggesting, which is Ki machloket be'edut, kach machloket bechametz. Just like they argue about what the margin of error is in edut, they also argue about eating chametz and how much we have to be concerned for this margin of error. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, hainu hafta amrina. What do you mean? We already just said that. We spent a whole long section explaining that it's really one and the same. It's just that, right, he's got this variation. He's got, right, there's outside, external reasons why we don't treat it the same. But theoretically, they really are the same. So comes the Gemara to tell you no. Ha kamashmalan. What's Rav Ashi really trying to tell us? Shinuye deshaninan shinuyehu velo tema tenaihi. What does this mean? This means that the answers that we gave. Now, what happens in the Gemara? What often happens in the Gemara is people are put up against a wall and they say, what you're saying doesn't make sense, right? Here we said, well, we have the section about the witnesses and we have the section about chametz, and they don't seem to match. And then they had to give answers. Now, sometimes when you're forced to give an answer, you just kind of give some sort of answer, but maybe it's not the real legitimate thing. So here he comes to say, don't think it was just an answer, and that really, maybe there were different traditions about what they held in each case. And I want to suggest maybe even more. Maybe you would think that there's two different tracks, and what we use for error in terms of let's be stringent in halacha would not be the same as what we use in the court. Comes Rav Ashi to say, no, we use the exact same principles. These are principles that guide us. We have a concept of what's a margin of error, and we're going to use that across the board. Now, yes, it could be we're going to look at each situation, and this might be different kinds of people and not the same kind of people as that. But again, it's that interplay between subjective and objective, right? We want to have an objective reality that there is this concept of margin of error that applies across the board. However, we might apply it to different situations depending on the situation. If you're talking about hours in the middle of the morning, those are going to be more likely you're going to confuse than hours in the middle of the day, right? So again, we're going to treat it, but theoretically, the concepts are really all one and the same, okay? I'm going to end this section of the lecture now, even though there's a lot more that can be said about this. And it's one of the things that if you learn Daf Yomi, you learn that when you go to a class about Daf Yomi, you might learn something, but what often happens is there's ideas that come up in the Daf that sit with you for the rest of the day, and you look into them more, and you have conversations with other people about it, and you can always go off in more directions. It gives you food for thought and things to think about. So the reason I taught this section was because, first of all, I always like to show that there's always something interesting in Daf Yomi, and this came up specifically this week. I always like to teach something that's relevant in the Daf for the week. And I wanted to show you that there's things in the book of Talmud that's written. It was a book written almost 2,000 years ago. And yet the concepts and the things that they discuss are things that still are very relevant and very interesting to us to grapple with and to see what the relevance is for us. I want to talk a little bit about Daf Yomi and what Daf Yomi is. So Rav Meir Shapiro started Daf Yomi in 1923, and he had two goals in mind. One was to basically have people open pages of the Talmud that most people were not learning. In the yeshivas, they were mostly learning certain chapters of the Talmud and certain mesechtot, certain tractates, and there were other parts that no one ever looked at. So that was number one. And number two, he wanted to create an idea that he describes it so beautifully. You get off a boat from Poland to America, and you immediately have something to speak to about the person that you see. Now, what happened when he did this was that it was all a man's world, and it was all men that were learning Daf Yomi for many, many years. And in fact, not just Daf Yomi, but Talmud in general was something that only individual women over the generations studied Talmud. Only about 70 years ago there started to be a number of schools, high schools like the Kibbutz Hadati in Israel, and some high schools in America like Maimonides and Flatbush and Ramaz that started teaching Talmud to girls. And that started the trend. And it took a while for it to catch on. About 30 years ago, 35 years ago, they started opening programs, advanced study for women or midrashot, post-high school programs where you could study Talmud. I was lucky to have gone to one of those, both a high school where I studied Talmud and post-high school program that I was able to study Talmud. And over the years, this has really changed. In fact, when I was studying, things are much different now. There's many more programs now where women, it's very new actually, where there's 5-year programs for women to study, or 3 to 5 year programs, like in Drisha Israel and in Midrashat Lindenbaum and in Migdal Oz. And these places now have, if I've forgotten some, I'm sorry, but there's a number of yeshivas or midrashot, yeshivot, where girls are studying Talmud at a very high level. That is something that did not happen until really recently. I always struggled that I didn't have a program to go to. I was in a scholars program at Lindenbaum, but it wasn't the same at all as it is right now. And things have we've really made great strides. However, we haven't made great enough strides because the average woman on the street still thinks that Talmud is not for them. So yes, we've succeeded in having more girls exposed to Talmud at a younger age and more women studying at an advanced stage, but there's still very, very few. For example, I'll give you also another change that's happened. When I was in Midrashah, so almost all the Gemara teachers were male. Now it's changed and there's many more female teachers. But again, it's still a handful of, not a handful, but compared to what it could be, it's still a small number. And many, many women still think that Talmud's not for them. What are the reasons? So I think that there's a number of reasons. One is I think that women have been denied access for a very long time. And that means that women who never study Talmud are intimidated by it because they never had access to it. It becomes very difficult and foreign to them. And it's hard to get over that. It's like learning a musical instrument, and you start off and you don't hear any music in the beginning. And it's hard to learn a new language and all of that. I think number two, women are intimidated. And that connects to that idea. It's intimidating. You don't want to do something that you're not going to be able to be successful at. Also, I think a lot of people think that the discussions in the Talmud are a little bit irrelevant. They're spending a long time discussing what the size of an etrog is, and what if it looks like this, and what if it looks like that, and it seems like it's just up in the air. And there's been many generations of basically people telling women, this is not for you, the schools don't do it. When there's no expectation that you're going to continue in this field, then nobody really ends up going into it. So I kind of view this like girls studying math. Right? Nobody says that girls shouldn't study math in school, even though people might say, oh, well, girls aren't so good at math, so maybe they shouldn't study math. But everybody thinks that girls should have a basic education in math, even if they're not going to go into the field after, not to mention that there's many females who are excellent at math and can excel in math and should be therefore exposed to it so that they can go in that direction. And I feel like it's the same with Talmud, but all the more so because this isn't math, this is our tradition, and it's all based in here. And to have women close to that world is crazy. So I started 8 years ago. After teaching Talmud for many years, I started teaching a Daf Yomi class. And when I looked on the internet to see, I never tried to teach an entire Daf of Gemara in 45 minutes. So I looked on the internet to see what's out there. And I was a little surprised, although I guess not so surprised, that there were no women out there. There were hundreds of Daf Yomi shiurim that you could find online, and not one by a woman. So I immediately decided, okay, if I'm going to teach this, I'm going to record, and I'm going to put it up on the internet so that women who want to learn can access Talmud from a woman. And not only that, but once that exists, it starts to change people's perspective about women in Talmud. If nobody's teaching it, well, then obviously people are going to say this is not a women's field. If you want to know that there's female teachers out there, it gives you also, if you want to study, you see that there's somewhere to go. So when it came time to the Siyum Hashas, I said, well, what are we going to do to celebrate our finishing? So what I really wanted to do was, because I realized that in the 7.5 years that I had done this, yes, many more women started studying Daf Yomi, not just because of my shiur, but because there's a number of shiurim around of women's groups that were studying, and it became a little bit more popular. But I would say a little bit more popular. We're not talking about masses of women. And I wanted to make a statement that Gemara learning is for women, and it can be for women, and there's women scholars out there, and there's regular average women who are studying the daf, and that this should just be something that was just there. And in fact, when I could think of two stories of my first year teaching that really gave me a lot of strength. The first was that on Erev Pesach, I remember some people asked me, are you teaching? And I said, why wouldn't I be teaching? I teach every day. I didn't teach on Shabbat, but I taught every other day. I said, it's Erev Pesach, we're busy, but I'm going to teach. And that day, I must have had about 10 women in the beginning that were coming on and off. Not everybody came every day. And 8 women showed up to that class. And I looked around and I said, wow, if I got almost everybody to come today, that's a huge success. That instead of being in the kitchen and cleaning up and doing all their turning over and everything else, these women said, learning Gemara is important to us. If Michelle's going to teach, we're going to come. And that was a very important moment for me. And the other was, we went away for a few months. My husband was ready for a sabbatical. And some of the women went to one of the local shiurim to see could they join their shiur while I was away. And they said to her, but why would you come here? There's a women's shiur. And I said, wow, like here I had not well-attended shiur, but yet people knew about it. And that in and of itself is important. And all of these are important steps to kind of get things to shift and to basically push the needle and for people to realize that women are part of this world. So with a lot of hard work, we pulled off a siyum. We got 3,300 people to attend. We had to close registration on a week and a half before the siyum because we were overbooked at that point. And that's when I remember our social media people had told us that you're going to get the most registration the last 2 weeks before the event. So I don't even know how many people would have come had we been able to really fill the room even more. 10,000 people watched from around the world. And it was a really it was an event, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a short clip from the Siyum for those who weren't there or didn't get to watch it. And then what we'll do is I will discuss what's happened post-Siyum. Okay, so I'll start the video.
אחרי 7.5 שנים סיימנו את הש"ס. הדרן הלך.
ועכשיו מתחילים שוב.
פותחות דף ביחד.
תצטרפי אלינו.
כל אחת ואחת יכולה ללמוד. סיום הש"ס העולמי לנשים שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
ועל שמכן יירשם המהלך הגדול הזה של גאולת התורה.
התורה מוסתרת בענן, כאילו הקדוש ברוך הוא מסתתר מאיתנו בענן. כשפתאום אתה מגלה שמה שנראה לך כמחיצה, כהסתר, כחומה בצורה, הוא בעצם יד מושטת. רק נדרשת האמונה לראות את הדברים.
דף יומי זה דרך נפלאה להפוך להיות חלק מהסיפור הזה של בית מדרש, מהסיפור הזה של לימוד תורה בעם ישראל. זה למצוא איפה הקדוש ברוך הוא מתחבא שם בתוך המילים.
והמחשבות שלי לוקחות אותי, עוד לפני שבאתי לפה ובטח עכשיו, קצת לאבא שלי, גם לו וגם לרב סולובייצ'יק שבחר ללמד נשים גמרא בשנות ה-60 באמריקה. ומודה לך בשמן של בנות ישראל על פתיחת שערי תורה ואמונה בפשטות ובגדולה. אני חושבת שזה לא כל כך מה שהם חשבו על נשים, זה מה שהם חשבו על לימוד תורה.
כמובן גם בסיס לעצמאות הלכתית ולאחריות על החיים הדתיים שלנו.
What an extraordinary gathering this is. The Gemara tells us of a moment in the time of Rabban Gamliel when the doors of the Beit Midrash were opened and Judaism became a democracy of learning, not just an aristocracy of one. Today, the doors of the Beit Midrash have opened in this new sense, and this too is an epoch-making event. This really is making history.
שרה שנירר שהקימה את בית יעקב, זו הייתה המטרה שלה, לחבר את הבנות, את הנשים, חזרה לעולם הרוחני, לעולם היהודי.
There was one enduring question that kept surfacing for me in learning the daf. What is human life worth? How blessed I am. We all are making this siyum together in Yerushalayim.
The Talmud belongs to each and every one of us.
יכול להיות שהגענו אנחנו לשלב שאנחנו כבר לא שלמות בלי לימוד התורה הזה, ושהקדוש ברוך הוא יראה את המאמץ שלנו וייתן לנו אותה במתנה.
Hope you enjoyed that. It's always fun to watch, even if you've seen it once before. So what happened after the Siyum was really an incredible thing, because I think it went beyond our wildest dreams, which was that the popularization of Daf Yomi really, it took off. And I think that there were all these women that said, oh, Gemara is not for me. Oh, it's not what I don't do it. But I think that really all those people were kind of saying it, but they wanted in, and I felt like this wall that was blocking everybody from coming in just kind of fell, and everybody came barging in. And it was this moment of realization that women are really a part of this and can be a part of it, and there's nothing to stop them from doing it. And I think that number one, if we go back to the issues of what was blocking women. So number one, they were denied access and kind of told, this isn't for you. The Siyum was an event that basically said, this is for you, and it became part of the mainstream. This is normal. This is, look at all these women who came, and this can talk to you also. I think the intimidation factor was very much dealt with by other factors, like first Rabbi Steinsaltz really spearheading and making a simple, easy, accessible translation to people, which then was taken by Koren, and now it's on Sefaria, and it's so easily accessible. And the Schottenstein, which came after Steinsaltz, which also, all these methods and all of the resources online. We have, at Hadran, we have WhatsApp groups of women all around the world. And it's amazing to see all the time women are sending, oh, there's this resource and this will help you with your learning and that will help you with your learning. And there's beautiful graphics that people are designing. And there's so much out there now that's making Talmud so much more accessible than it ever was before. So I think number one, the access they were denied and told this isn't for you was broken. Number two, the intimidation factor was eased by the accessibility of learning. The issue of irrelevancy. So that has been changed, and I think a lot in part by women, because a lot of women who write about the Talmud write about how it connects to their lives, like Alana Kirshen's memoir about If All the Seas Were Ink. She inspired many, many women to start. I'm sure there's women among you here that have started learning because of her book. For example, we have on Hadran's site, we generate content by women that write commentary on the Talmud. So there's an editor from Makor Rishon. She's the junior editor, I think, of Makor Rishon, Orly Goldklang. She writes a piece every week in Makor Rishon showing how the Gemara relates to her life and what she takes from it to her life. And I think that in my shiurim, I try to put an emphasis on how we can connect this to our daily lives. So that's another thing. And I want to just talk about, again, there's two issues. There's the Talmud itself, and then there's Daf Yomi. And I want to talk about two aspects of Daf Yomi that are very compelling. The first thing is that Daf Yomi is very rigorous. Anyone I know, I see faces here and names of women I know who learn with me, and Daf Yomi is incredibly rigorous. On the other hand, the rigorous, that aspect of it is so empowering and so, it gives you an anchor in your day. And I can't tell you what messages I've gotten from people who specifically now, while we're in the middle of a pandemic and everything is a little bit chaotic, there's something about having that anchor every single day. And you know that no matter what happens, I'm doing this today. It's really kept a lot of people grounded. And the second thing, which I think is even greater than that, is it's the real connector between people. And that as Rabbi Meir Shapiro talked about this global conversation, and people call it the biggest book club in the world. And it's this way of connecting people all around the world to each other. And I see that with my shir. I have a Zoom every morning with 50 to 55 people now. And it's connecting people from Australia and Israel and America, West Coast, East Coast. And it's this amazing connector, and the conversations that go on between people is inspiring, and it connects us all doing something important with our lives that we're sharing with each other. And I think about at the Siyums, we had 1,000 people attending the Siyums for Eruvin. You know, forget about Brachot and Shabbat, but the fact that 1,000 people, and of the people who registered for the Siyum through us, between the Hebrew and the English, there were 942 people said that they finished the whole Masechet. And I thought that was an amazing accomplishment in terms of the real outgrowth, and not just to Daf Yomi, but I'll give you another example. There was a woman in South Africa who went from Israel to teach there, and she said she tried to get a Gemara Shir going for women. Nobody was interested. After the Siyum, she started 3 classes that were all full. And there was such a growing interest in studying. And I want to leave you on a high, but I also want to leave you on something that we have to think about going forward. Because yes, this is all great, and there's a huge outpouring of women coming to learn that they've never learned before. But the fact is, we still have where to go. And we still have a lot of schools that don't think that girls should be learning Gemara. And we still have girls that aren't exposed to it at a young age. It's great to come to Daf Yomi at an older age and start learning, but it's hard. It's not easy. And without that background that the girls get in school, and without that feeling of our society, and let's take the women who are learning in advanced programs, it's amazing. But the fact is, there's a big struggle because they don't have jobs for themselves either. There's a big issue with these programs. They're training women, and then the question is, what are they going to do with what they get, and what are the jobs available to them? So these are all directions that we have to go in, and we have to think going forward how we're going to manage to change things. And I think it's, again, change in Judaism is always a slow process. And I think that the Siyum was a great springboard. And again, it's not just the siyum, it's the fact that it happened at the same time that all sorts of other things were going on. And like I said, these advanced programs, and that there's more female teachers out there than there ever were. My students study in my daughters study in Pelech, and they have all female Gemara teachers, never a male Gemara teacher. And that's an amazing thing. And they're young and they're just out of, studying, and it's amazing. But we still have a way to go, and we have a lot of work. And at Hadran, we're working on trying to change things. I want to just take you on a quick tour of our site so you can see. This is Hadran's site. You can find today's Daf Yomi. You can find a link to the Zoom at 7:10 every morning. Now there's also a Zoom in Hebrew at 6:20 in the morning. You can find, there's a week summary by Tamara Spitz. There's Flashback, which is a historical blog by Shuli Mishkin. For example, she talked about exactly what we were discussing in our class about sundials and how they told time in those days. There's Talking Talmud, which is a daily podcast by Ann Gordon and Yardena Osband. It's about the daf, but a little bit off the daf, more in-depth. There's, for example, this is also a good example. Not only do we have female scholars on our site, but here's Ellie Gelman. She's a listener, and she wrote an article that went up today on our site. Or Rena and Danny Yellen together, a couple, they're also learning the daf, and they wrote an article that went up. So the idea is to share both professional women Torah scholars and also the fact that every person who learns can bring their own understanding into the daf, and everybody's opinion is important, and what everybody has to say is really important. And together, we're going to build this community, which is going to ultimately change the way people perceive Talmud study and women and their part in Talmud study. And that will ultimately have repercussions on the community as a whole. So thank you for listening today. It was a pleasure to be with you. And now we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. There's just two. One is it possible to join the Daf Yomi in the middle of a cycle and not necessarily in the beginning? And two is, there have been women who have been studying Gemara and Talmud for decades in other streams of Judaism, such as the conservative and such. Is there any kind of relationship with them?
Relationship between me and those women, is that the question?
Yeah, but between Hadran or the movement that you're speaking of women studying these days.
Okay, so first of all, let me start with that one, and then we'll get to the other question. So there's a lot of people from all streams of Judaism that learn with me. There's even in the beginning, I remember there was someone studying in the Reform movement to be a rabbi. There's women from the conservative movement. There's rabbis, male rabbis also from the conservative movement, or people. What is unique about the way I teach is that it's open to everybody, and that everybody can come and learn from there. And I think even within those communities, even though, yes, it's been studied for a long time, I also don't think that there was always such a thirst as there is now. And again, I don't take the credit for all this. I think that there's a lot of reasons, this was kind of my share, so I was talking about, but there's a lot of reasons why Daf Yomi kind of, took off. And it's specifically taken off also in the non-Orthodox world, which I think is really interesting and a great development. I'll give you an example. Before the Siyum, the talk was Daf Yomi, and I saw a post on Facebook. Somebody said, I want to know, I understand the average Daf Yomi learner is a kippah wearer who goes to shul, and, that's our average. I want to know some of the, non-average people. So a bunch of people started saying women. Okay, they started listing a bunch of women. So he says, okay, I understand that the women, we're there, we're done. Okay. I said, first of all, that's really not true. We're not done. The fact that you found a handful of women, but okay. And then he said, and then they said, what about non-Orthodox? And it was very hard to find non-Orthodox. I don't think it was as common as it is now. Again, you might distinguish Talmud Study and Daf Yomi, but the Daf Yomi movement has taken off all over. And again, it's a lot of different factors that contributed to it. I don't know what all of them are, but it's great. And I have people in my class every day who come from different denominations. And I think that that's great. The second question about studying. So the Gemara is not written as a book that starts in the beginning and goes in order. It's a very different style book, and you can really, what's great about it is you can really enter any time. And you can even enter in the middle of a Masechet. You might be a little confused and missed a few of the basics, but it's the kind of thing that you can enter anytime you want. And And eventually you'll get back to the beginning if you don't finish the siyum with everybody. There's lots of people who start mid-cycle. And it's definitely, most people actually don't end up starting. A lot of people start in the beginning, but many, many, many people enter in the middle. So yes, you can enter at any time.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did. And I'm going to open the microphones up now so that everyone can say thank you and send regards. And thank you all for being here with us this evening, and we'll see you in our next events. The microphones are open.
So I just
Thank
want to
you
say
so
it's nice to
much.
see all these.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you,
know.
Michelle. See you later.
Wonderful as usual, Rabbi Farber.
Movie Yentl, yes.
Thank you,
wanted to get
Michelle.
Barbara Streisand at the Siyum to say something, do something, but it didn't happen. We thought that would be nice.
Maybe next time.
Exactly.
Yishar kochach.
Thank you. Great to see you guys. It's nice to see people whose faces I know and people whose names I know, but not their faces. Nice that you're here.
Whoever wants to say something should unmute their microphone. Vidi, your microphone was muted.
I can't seem to unmute it.
There you go.
You're unmuted now. Oh,
We hear you.
no, you're back muted.
Now?
Oh,
Yeah, now
yes.
we hear you.
So I just wanted to say I'm getting a lot of nachas from this younger generation that's doing things I could only dream of.
Nice.
Happy to be part of it.
I'm very happy to be part of it. Michelle, I do every morning your class. I usually get it with YouTube.
Okay.
Because I can't get in there because I'm in Houston, Texas.
Okay.
Oh.
It's great. Yeah, I know your name, so now it's good that I see a face.
Thank you all once more. Happy Hanukkah. We'll see you in our next events.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy
Laila
Hanukkah.
tov.
Thank you. See you tomorrow, Michelle.
Okay, see you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy Hanukkah.